On Sinai, amid the smoke and blackness that covered the mountain, a man asked God for something no ancient text of the region dared to grant. He wanted to see him, not satisfied with the voice, not content with the fire or the cloud. Moses, the same man who had spoken with that presence face to face for 40 days, still felt something was missing, and what he asked for next would test the very limits of what Exodus says a human being can survive. The scene unfolds shortly after the episode of the golden calf, when the people of Israel, impatient with their leader's prolonged absence on the mountain, had melted down their jewelry to build an image they could worship while they waited. Moses came down from Sinai, witnessed the betrayal, smashed the stone tablets he was carrying, and had to climb back up to negotiate once again the survival of the covenant between his people and the deity who had brought them out of Egypt. This wasn't a quick or easy negotiation. The text describes Moses interceding, pleading with that presence not to abandon his people in the desert, reminding him of promises made generations earlier to the patriarchs, as if the entire future of the project they'd started together hinged on the exact words this Israelite leader could find in that moment of total vulnerability. It's in that context of fracture and reconciliation, in chapter 33 of the book of Exodus, that Moses made the request that would turn this episode into one of the most studied and debated paradoxes in the entire Bible. What makes this story worth our attention isn't just the drama of the moment. It's a contradiction the text itself acknowledges and doesn't try to hide. Just a few verses earlier, the same book states flatly that no man can see God's face and live. It's one of the firmest rules in the entire biblical tradition, repeated elsewhere in the Old Testament, almost presented as a physical law of the religious universe ancient Israel was building. And yet that very same chapter shows Moses asking for exactly that, and shows an answer that, read closely, isn't a simple no, but something far more nuanced and fascinating. It's almost as if the text itself felt uneasy with its own rule, like it needed to leave a crack open right where it had just slammed a door shut. To understand why Moses dared to ask for what he asked, you have to understand who this man was within the Exodus narrative at that exact point in the story. He wasn't just another prophet among the many the Bible mentions throughout its pages. According to the text itself, Moses already spoke with God in a way no other figure in the Pentateuch ever would, before or after him. The book states it explicitly. God spoke with Moses face to face, the way a man speaks with his friend. In the context of ancient Near Eastern religious literature, that line was a radical claim, because in the neighboring cultures of Egypt and Mesopotamia, gods communicated with humans through dreams, oracles, intermediary priests, or natural omens, almost never through a direct, sustained dialogue like the one the text attributes to this particular relationship. No Egyptian pharaoh, however divine his office was considered, held daily conversations with his gods, the way this shepherd-turned-leader did, and that difference isn't a minor detail. It's part of what the text itself seems determined to underline about just how singular this relationship was. That closeness is exactly what makes the moment so gripping when Moses decides to ask for more. The text shows him asking literally to see God's glory, a Hebrew word translators have rendered many different ways over the centuries, but one whose root points to something like weight, manifest presence, the visible and overwhelming substance of the divine. He wasn't asking for a symbolic vision or a poetic metaphor. He was asking to experience, directly and physically, the one thing that, according to the very rules the Bible lays out elsewhere, no human body could withstand without being destroyed in the attempt. The answer Moses gets is where this story turns truly extraordinary, because it's neither an outright refusal nor a full concession. It lands in some in-between space that generations of readers and interpreters have spent over 2,000 years trying to untangle. The text describes God responding that he will let all his goodness pass before Moses and will proclaim his name, but immediately follows it with the line that freezes the entire scene. "You cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live." Same rule, repeated, confirmed at the exact instant it seemed about to break. And yet buried in that same answer is a concession rarely given its due. The promise to proclaim the divine name in front of Moses, a gesture that, in the ancient Near Eastern mindset, meant revealing the deepest possible layer of one's identity, something no other human in the entire story would ever receive in quite the same way. And here's where the story does something genuinely unique in all of ancient religious literature, because the text doesn't just stop at the refusal, it lays out an actual, almost technical solution to the contradiction. God tells Moses to stand in a cleft of the rock, a specific crack in the mountain, and that while the glory passes by, a divine hand will cover him to protect him for the exact instant it goes past. Only afterward, once that presence has already moved on, will the hand be lifted and Moses will be allowed to see, not the face, but the back. What some translators read as the afterglow, the trace, whatever remains visible once the unbearable part has moved far enough away that it no longer destroys the one looking at it. Sit with that for a second, because it's easy to read past it and miss the careful internal logic the text is building. This isn't about God being weak, and it isn't about his face functioning like some literal weapon. What the story seems to be suggesting, and what generations of Jewish and Christian readers have argued over for centuries, is that the divine presence, in its fullest and most direct form, carries an intensity that no created finite being can hold without being undone by it. Much like the human eye can't stare directly into the sun without permanent damage, not because the sun is hostile, but because what it puts out simply overwhelms the capacity of the organ trying to take it in. It's a subtle but crucial distinction, because it shifts the whole problem out of moral territory, where you might read this as punishment or arbitrary restriction, and into something closer to physics, where the impossibility comes down to a mismatch of natures that no amount of willpower, not even Moses's, could ever force its way past. That comparison isn't a modern invention or a stretch. It shows up again and again in how ancient Jewish commentators themselves tried to explain this passage over the centuries. The idea that there's a built-in distance between the created and the uncreated, and that this distance isn't some arbitrary punishment, but a structural feature of the universe, as this tradition understood it, is one of the concepts most picked apart and reinterpreted throughout the history of Jewish theology, from the earliest rabbis all the way to the medieval mystics who, centuries later, were still trying to figure out exactly what it was Moses managed to glimpse in that crack in the rock. Some of those medieval commentators even argued over the precise meaning of the word translated as back, debating whether the text meant a literal physical form or whether it was deliberately using vague language to describe something no human vocabulary could ever fully pin down. What makes this story even more fascinating is what happens right after, in the scene that closes out the chapter, described with a level of physical detail that's remarkably specific for literature of that era. When Moses comes down the mountain after this encounter, his face has visibly changed in front of everyone around him. The text says his skin was glowing, radiating something the people couldn't look at directly without fear, to the point that Moses had to cover his face with a veil every time he finished speaking to the community, only removing it again when he went back into the divine presence inside the tent of meeting. In other words, the text isn't just describing the experience of seeing, it's describing the lasting physical aftermath on the body of the man who lived through it, as if the contact, even filtered and shielded, still left behind a mark the rest of the people could plainly see. Here's a question worth sitting with, one that almost never comes up when this episode gets told in passing, and it's exactly the kind of question that separates surface-level curiosity from actually understanding the text. Why does the same people who just moments earlier had built a golden calf because they needed something visible and tangible to worship end up afraid of Moses' own glowing face? The answer the story seems to point to is that there's a fundamental difference between manufacturing a controllable image of the divine and confronting the real, unfiltered effect of having been near the genuine thing. The golden calf was safe precisely because it was fake, while Moses' face was terrifying precisely because what it reflected, even if it was only the faintest trace of a trace, had actually been real. There's something almost ironic in that contrast. The same people who felt perfectly comfortable bowing down to an object they'd built with their own hands couldn't hold the gaze of proof that the transcendent, far from being a comfortable invention, had left a genuine mark on a human face. This tension between closeness and danger, between intimacy and distance, doesn't end with the book of Exodus. It becomes one of the questions that Jewish tradition, and later Christian tradition, would keep wrestling with for centuries afterward. If no one can see God and live, how should we read other passages in the Old Testament where figures like Jacob claim to have seen God face to face, or where the elders of Israel describe seeing him on the mountain unharmed? Commentators and interpreters who studied these texts across generations came up with different explanations, some suggesting there were different degrees or manifestations of the divine presence, others proposing that what those figures saw were reduced forms, messengers, or representations, not the unfiltered totality that Exodus describes Moses coming so close to experiencing on that rock at Sinai. What's remarkable is that the New Testament itself, written centuries later within a tradition that directly inherited these texts, explicitly picks this episode back up to build one of its most important theological arguments. The Gospel of John states directly that no one has ever seen God, echoing almost word for word the same idea running through Exodus. And from that same starting point builds the claim that only through an intermediary figure can humanity access what would otherwise stay permanently out of reach. In other words, the paradox Moses lived through on that mountain was never resolved or forgotten as the centuries passed. It became one of the central questions later religious tradition kept trying to answer, generation after generation, across more than 1,000 years of uninterrupted theological reflection. Even outside of Christianity, within rabbinic Judaism itself, that same tension kept fueling debates over how it's even possible to talk about a God who is simultaneously close and utterly inaccessible, without sliding into either the coldness of a distant being or an overfamiliarity that would reduce the divine to just another presence among the world's many presences. And here's where it's worth pausing on something almost never mentioned when this story gets told at a surface level, because it completely changes how you understand it. What Moses asked for on Sinai wasn't idle curiosity or spiritual vanity. It was the logical endpoint of a relationship the text had been building from much earlier, from the burning bush in the desert of Midian, through the 10 plagues, the crossing of the sea, and the 40 days on the mountaintop receiving the law. Every one of those episodes had drawn this man progressively closer into an intimacy with the divine that no other figure in the Old Testament would ever reach, and the request to see God's glory wasn't some isolated impulse. It was the exact point where all that accumulated closeness finally hit the structural limit. The religious system itself had set from the very beginning. If you think about it, this story raises a question that still resonates well outside any particular religious framework: the question of what it actually means to fully know something or someone. Is total intimacy even possible between two radically different natures? Or is there always, inevitably, some zone that stays hidden, not for lack of closeness, but because of the very nature of the thing being known? The text of Exodus seems to suggest that even the man who spoke with God face to face, who received the law directly from his hands, who spent more time in the divine presence than any other human being described anywhere in the Hebrew Bible, still hit a limit he couldn't cross, without ceasing to be who he was. Maybe that's the most honest lesson buried in this story, that total closeness and total knowledge aren't necessarily the same thing, and that even the deepest relationships can survive, paradoxically, precisely because of a zone of mystery that neither side ever fully manages to erase. I'm curious what you think about this. Do you believe there's some form of knowledge or closeness in any area of life that necessarily has a limit you can't cross without being completely transformed by the attempt? Let me know in the comments, because that question, first asked more than 2,000 years ago on top of a mountain in the desert, still doesn't have a single final answer. What's left in the end from this scene in the cleft of the rock isn't just the story of a man who nearly saw the impossible. It's a reminder that some of humanity's deepest questions weren't born in libraries or universities, but in moments of maximum tension between the human desire for total closeness and the limits existence itself seems to place on that desire. Moses came down off that mountain with a transformed face, forced to cover it so his own people could keep looking at him without fear, and that image of a man physically marked by having been near something that exceeded his own nature remains one of the most powerful metaphors the biblical tradition left us about what it really means to draw close to the transcendent without completely losing who you were before you did. If this paradox left you thinking, subscribe to keep digging up the internal tensions the biblical text holds within its own pages. And share this with someone who thinks they already know the story of Moses, because chances are no one ever told them about the cleft in the rock.